Tena koutou, talofa lava, kia orana, maloelele, bula, hello. Welcome to the third in a series of the University of Auckland's Public Policy Institute sponsored webinars on issues of public interest. I am Tim Fadgen, lecturer in politics and international relations and the associate director of graduate programs at the Public Policy Institute, the University of Auckland. Today, we've come together to consider an issue that has been widely discussed in various circles amongst policymakers, public health officials, business leaders, scholars, the creation of a Pacific bubble for travel, tourism, and trade as we all weather the global COVID-19 pandemic. The deep ties Aotearoa New Zealand shares with the Pacific Island nations, between nations and peoples, are at the heart of our discussion today. Those of us with family and friends in the region have all likely been affected by the pandemic and the ripple effects of this great tragedy. From stranded travelers, extended quarantine, limited air travel, delayed medical treatment, and the disappearance of travelers in the islands, and with them, essential trade and critical economic activity. While reasonable minds may differ on just how we should move ahead as a region, a fulsome consideration of how we move forward together is critical. The idea then for today's webinar is to bring some of these perspectives together, hear these voices, and consider points of view. I will introduce the speakers to you in just a moment, but would like to say first, for those of you joining this series for the first time, how we will proceed today. Following my brief words of introduction, each of our speakers will have up to 10 minutes for their remarks. I'll watch the time here and give them a wave of the hand when they're about a minute out from the end of their time. To our participants, please note that while the chat function is inactive for this session, we do have Q&A. Please enter any questions you have for the panel here, and you can vote on them and move them up on the priority list. I'll organize these for some Q&A at the end of our session today, once our final speaker has concluded. In the past, we've had a few minutes for questions, so that's the hope for us today. Now, without further ado, we're very honored today to have with us 4 leaders and thinkers representing a range of perspectives, many of whom have been active in the public discourse around this issue. Our first panelist is Associate Professor Collin Tukuitonga, who is the inaugural Associate Dean Pacific and Associate Professor of Public Health in the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences at the University of Auckland. He was the Director General of the largest and oldest development organization in the Pacific region, the Pacific Community, for 6 years, until December of 2019. Collin has served in a number of other roles, senior roles in New Zealand, the Pacific, and internationally, including as the Director of Public Health, for the New Zealand Ministry of Health, the Chief Executive for the Ministry of Pacific Island Affairs, and the Head of Surveillance and Prevention of Chronic NCDs at the WHO in Geneva. Following Collin will be Yvonne Lucas. Yvonne is currently the Executive Director of the New Zealand Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, a post she has held for the past 4 years. Prior to this role, Yvonne worked at Treasury, MFAT, the Ministry of Health, and MB, where she also served as the Director of the Ministry of Tourism. Her work in all departments, with the exception of the posting to the New Zealand delegation to the UN, focused on international trade and economic issues, including closer economic relations with Australia, APEC, and various free trade agreements, including leading the health negotiations on the TPP. After Yvonne, we'll hear from Don Mann. Don is the Chief Executive of the Pacific Media Network, the public broadcaster of Pacific content in New Zealand. Don was previously the Chief Executive of the Pacific Cooperation Foundation, whose mission is to increase cooperation and understanding amongst peoples of the Pacific region. Don has led initiatives across the Pacific region around leadership, development, cultural cooperation, private sector management, capability building, plus partnerships between Maori and Pacific resource owners. Don has also served on several New Zealand-based business councils advocating for trade across the Pacific region. Our final speaker today, Dr. Jemima Tia Tia Si, is the co-head of school, Te Wananga o Waipapa, School of Maori Studies and Pacific Studies, University of Auckland. Jemima has a public health background and was one of 6 panelists on the New Zealand government's 2018 Mental Health and Addiction Inquiry. Her research interests include Pacific studies, mental health, well-being, suicide prevention, youth development, and Pacific health inequities. So with those introductions out of the way, I would like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Collin Tukuitonga.
Well, thank you, Tim, and kia ora tātou. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with you this afternoon, evening. I won't bore you with the background to the pandemic. I assume we've all heard enough about it. My comments will be pretty much around why I think a New Zealand Pacific bubble, i.e. a quarantine-free travel, was the right one. I think some or many of you would be aware that at a time when New Zealand was COVID-free, there was some 3 weeks of no cases reported in New Zealand. I was pretty keen to try to encourage the opening up of particularly travel between New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. And in fact, I ventured out to say well ahead of a trans-Tasman bubble, which has been the favorite of many people. And I'll tell you in a little bit why I think a Pacific New Zealand bubble was the priority, and still is the priority in my view. Obviously, when we opened up the borders and we started reporting cases in the quarantine facility at the airport in Auckland, I kind of, I suppose I became a bit more careful because everyone knows that a few cases of COVID-19 in one of the smaller islands would pretty much be disastrous given the limited capability, both in terms of equipment and people and resources in the small islands' health systems in order to be able to deal with the COVID-19. In other words, I think the measures that were taken to shut the borders and to put restrictions in the movement of people into and out of the islands was the right one. And so as I say, when we started reporting cases at the border here in New Zealand, I decided to tone down my advocacy, if you like, because obviously even though the risks are low, it's not zero. But my position has always been that I think a New Zealand Pacific bubble is the priority, and there are 4 reasons why I say that. The first and foremost is really a risk assessment one, meaning there were many of the islands that are part of this bubble have never reported a case of COVID-19. Not all of the islands are COVID-free. I mean, Fiji for a time and others, but certainly the islands I had in mind, Cooks, Niue, Tokelau, Samoa, Tonga, were and remain COVID-free. When we look at Australia, and in the last day or so, you will have seen that things have gotten out of hand in Victoria. In other words, I felt that the risk of introducing COVID-19 into the islands and back into New Zealand was the most important criteria. And I'm still of that view. And that's why I do not support those in New Zealand, the media, and some who are advocating the opening up of a trans-Tasman bubble. I think the risks are far too great to us. Remember, we have never had any community transmission in New Zealand. And the community transmission is the element that we should be concerned about. The second reason why I advocated a Pacific New Zealand travel bubble is economics. Unfortunately, one of the real consequences of restricting movement of people is you restrict tourism into the islands. And many of these islands rely heavily on tourism, and certainly many of the islands rely on trade with New Zealand. And I thought that provided the risk of COVID being introduced into the islands or into New Zealand was low, I thought there was a compelling reason for us to consider a Pacific New Zealand bubble to enable tourists to return to the islands, and of course the small businesses in the islands would benefit from New Zealanders visiting. And by the way, I think obviously I would add family and friends into that mix, because I think everyone knows that New Zealand is home to many people from the islands, and I'm sure after a prolonged period of restrictions, people would want to see their families. So that, I think, is still the case. Tourism plays a big role. The governments in the islands are not in a position to provide the kind of provisions that the New Zealand government has provided to small business owners in the island. So I think there's a very good economic reason why we would want to consider the Pacific first. The third reason is a constitutional one. By that I mean, if you look at the realm countries of Cooks, Niue, and Tokelau, they're New Zealand citizens. They just happen to live out in the big blue, but effectively they're citizens of our nation, and citizenship does come with some benefits and responsibilities. And I am aware, for example, that the New Zealand government is aware of that, and I commend them for some of the activities they put in place to support those island nations. The fourth reason is really one of health services. Auckland is and remains the main center for referral of sick, very ill people from the islands who cannot be treated in the islands. And that's a very real concern. And that's why I thought it was important that we enable that to happen. Auckland is a place where people obtain not just medical advice, but essential drugs, medication, and whatnot. And so they're the reasons why I have and continue to advocate for a New Zealand Pacific travel bubble ahead of anything else that the New Zealand government might wish to do. And I'm still of that view. And of course, there are very strong historical relationships between New Zealand and the islands. We have a treaty of friendship with Samoa. And I don't think the All Blacks team will be the same if we don't maintain those links. So Tim, with those few remarks, happy to comment a little later on, but thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Collin. Yvonne? Yvonne, you're on mute.
Sorry about that, Tim. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Collin, for your remarks and your perspectives, which I would share. I've been asked to talk about trade, and by its very nature, the scope of issues that fall under trade are very dry. So I want to say from the outset that what I have to say now or reflect on in no way diminishes the terrible impact that this virus has had on the Pacific Islands. And the one thing that's sure is that these are very uncertain times, and very few people are prepared to nail themselves to the mast on predictions about how things are going to evolve. But a bit of context. The speed with which things went belly up was phenomenal. I mean, the whole world just crashed. And by the same token, the recovery, in my view, is going to be very long and slow and fraught. And that'll be for the islands and it will be so for New Zealand. On the general analysis side, the IMF has actually predicted, on a best guess sort of basis, I suppose, that the global economy will fall by 5% and the Asia regional economy by about 4.7%. And to put this in context, after the general financial crisis, things only fell by 0.6%. So this is a huge, huge hit. And the slowdown in world trade is predicted to be between 13 to 32% by the WTO. So I don't think the implications of this have been fully absorbed by businesses and by the general populace, and also indeed by the policy community. My own view is that we're on a U-curve, a U-shaped recovery, and the bottom will be very, very flat for a long time, with little ups and downs, but essentially flat, before we start to see some sustained possible light at the end of the tunnels. Now, a bit of context for about risk when thinking about trade. Anti-globalization voices at this juncture are and will continue to be very strong, as we've seen the impact of these failed supply chains, etc. But retrenching would be a triumph of short-termism, in my view. The risk associated with globalization, and as pointed out by this pandemic, can better be managed. Without doubt, we can do a lot better, and we must do so collectively. But we have to recognize that the way forward is to manage these risks and evolve our policy responses. Globalization, and this applies to the Pacific Islands as much as to us, has brought huge benefits. But we need to acknowledge that the rewards have been far from proportionately shared, and a lot of work and reflection needs to be undertaken both in the regional community and in the international community about how we improve inclusiveness in the next generation. It's a central challenge. Everybody's facing it. You're facing it domestically in most economies, and you are certainly will have to address this issue internationally. The fact is that the way forward is not to retrench, but under what, no matter how seemingly compelling some would advocate for this, we have to move forward with new policy and intervention proposals. Okay, that's my view. Others will undoubtedly want to challenge that. To that end, we all need to support the benefits that are still inherent in the international institutions like the WTO, the APEX, and indeed the institutions that define New Zealand and the Pacific. So I think that's really important. The critical issue will be to commit to this and also to recognize the need to build new capabilities. And when I talk about new capabilities, they're not just capabilities. It's not an issue just for developing countries. It's also an issue for the likes of New Zealand. We have to build new capabilities to understand what is going on and how and what the new appropriate responses might be. So I'm just referring to some notes here. So I'd want to say that at this juncture, the Pacific Islands must be part of this. The bubble that we're proposing will be the first vehicle by which we can start to entertain some pretty new ideas as people start to interact together again, and will pave the way, hopefully, as things get better, for a new collective look at the challenges ahead. Now, turning now, I think, to this is where I put on a bit more of a policy wonk hat, to the specific issues that need to be addressed to maximize returns under a Pacific bubble. And in this context, I think of a bubble slightly bigger perhaps than you do, Collin, but that's just for example's sake. It's quite conceivable in the future that more might enter the bubble. And, you know, if it was me, I mean, in a sense, you go back to the old way of thinking of, you know, doing a good SWOT analysis. What are our existing strengths? What are the weaknesses and the opportunities and threats? And I think the other thing that we have to think about, and that's currently, the other thing we have to think about is how we put a time frame around that. I mean, there are short-term issues associated with strengths and weaknesses, there are medium-term issues, and there are certainly long-term strategic issues. And I suppose one of the positives we have at the moment is that we have a little bit of time to reflect on some of these things, notwithstanding the difficulties that everybody is facing. If I was to look at the tourism sector in that context, and I'm not a tourism expert vis-a-vis the Pacific, but I suppose no sector has been more hard hit than the tourism sector. The World Tourism Council is predicting up to 50 million jobs have been lost in this sector. So, but there are some questions, some starting points on this. There's certainly we create a bubble, there's certainly a pent-up demand for people to go on holiday. And at the moment, under a bubble, the first port of call will be to go to the Pacific. But there are some questions that I think we need to ask ourselves in that context is, if a bubble were to be declared in the next week or two, how ready are our economies to gear up in terms of the product offerings, the supply chains, the other issues around which people will want to have confidence? And here I have, you raise issues such as health, etc. And indeed, the whole regulatory experience of entering and exiting a particular economy for a holiday. Now, the first experience of all these people who will take up the offer, and I think there are a lot from my own chats around this, will be very important for determining the future of the value proposition of going to the Pacific. So there is something that's really, really important in terms of getting the product mix and the quality of that mix right. Now, it's not just the hotels, it's the quality associated with the administrative stuff as well. And there's another issue that needs to be considered is that the bubble itself is not sufficient. There's a huge campaign in New Zealand to get New Zealanders to enjoy their own backyard from a tourism perspective and to support our local industry. So there's very strong competition, even if when the bubble opens up. It's not like everybody is going to go and think about a holiday in the Pacific Islands. So that's, and so all these things require some planning and some strategies, even in the short term, to think about. And issues that come up in that context would be risk management associated with their supply chains, other than people coming in, securing appropriate commitments from airlines and shipping companies to actually come to the party, building confidence and communicating that confidence in the health systems, etc. So in the medium term, in that context, there are clearly opportunities, but actually very, very big risks when regional and global markets open up. Collin touched on one, which is, you know, it may not be that risk-free from a health point of view, but setting that aside, competition will be much fiercer at that point as the Southeast Asian markets open up, and already we see Europe opening up, and so New Zealanders and Australians will look further afield. So the question then becomes, what sort of mitigation strategies should be employed both by governments and business to actually address some of these challenges? The other question, I think, and this goes very much to Collin's point, is will New Zealand be able indefinitely to employ an elimination approach? Now, we're probably going to see that played out in some of the lead up to the election. What then? What then for the Pacific Islands at that point? Is it something that the two governments can still seek to manage appropriately? Will there be, as opening up take? Oh, sorry. Right. I'll move on very quickly, but you get the gist of where we're going on this. There are infinite number of questions that can be asked, and I think that should be discussed more broadly between governments and their communities. Now, the second, very, very quickly, I will do a little bit of advocacy for putting in the, you want to butt in? Are you okay? Okay, advocacy for getting the PACER Plus ratified. Now, this has had a lot of pros and cons associated with it, but having been a trade negotiator and negotiated a number of agreements, all I can say is as soon as you get this agreement in place, you have an instrument ratified and underway. You have an instrument on which to actually build further discussion about issues. And I'm in no doubt that as we're not going back to the old normal, we're going to a new normal, and there'll be many, many issues that will need to be discussed. And having an instrument in place will actually help in that regard. Not only does it deal with the traditional issues of tariffs, technical barriers to trade, but it has all the institutional capability functions associated with it as well. So I would be a very strong advocate for actually trying to move that along as far as possible. Now, the third area, and I'd be happy to take some discussion on that afterwards. The final area I think I would like to just reflect on. I have no answers, and it's just something that I think there is more to be leveraged out, and that is working with the Pacific economy in New Zealand. Now, this Treasury a few years ago did a study, and the Pacific economy in New Zealand is not insignificant. It's not insignificant for New Zealand, certainly not insignificant for the Pacific Islands, but there are a lot of points of potential leverage within that probably need to be explored. And that includes, undoubtedly, I mean, there's a massive asset base here. There's a lot of people movement. There's a changing environment in the digitalization of trade and services. The question then remains, what scope is there now to actually identify new issues for cooperation? Okay, obviously I miscued in understanding how much time
That's okay. If we're doing this parliamentary style, Collin yielded a few minutes back, so that's no problem. Thank you, Yvonne. So I'd like to now ask Don to join us. Don?
Thank you, and tēnā koutou katoa, and thanks to the Public Policy Institute of the University of Auckland. You mentioned I was CEO of Pacific Cooperation Foundation. I was up until yesterday. I've been CEO of Pacific Media Network for 6 hours. So my discussion will be primarily in the context of regionalism. And it's the notion of regionalism that I wanted to just focus my few minutes on. And then I'll dive deeper down into things from a regional perspective, a country perspective, and then look at at an organisation perspective, a company perspective. Just a reminder to the people watching, in 2014, the leaders of the region, the 18 leaders of the Pacific Island Forum, developed this notion of Pacific regionalism. And it's interesting, I had a read of it just before we come on here to see if there's anything helpful as signposts to take us forward in COVID-19 and the creation of a Pacific bubble. And I'll just read out a couple of things here. This concept of Pacific regionalism 2014 is built on a common sense of identity. It talks about sharing institutions, resources, and markets. It talks about a purpose of complementing national efforts, overcoming common constraints, enhancing sustainable and inclusive development for Pacific Island countries and the region as a whole. So I put forward that this concept of regionalism adopted by the 18 Pacific Island countries and leaders is as relevant now, and perhaps even more so, as it was in 2014 when it was developed. If I come back to a New Zealand level and Aotearoa level, and picking up on some of the thoughts of Dr. Tukuitonga, is I'm concerned at some of the general discussion, if you were to read mass media, and some of the noise, frankly, that I find unhelpful in talking about arguing for a Pacific bubble versus a trans-Tasman bubble, and it's almost a bi-type argument. It's done with the mindset they were operating in a competitive space. Now, if you accept, based on the fact that Niue, Tukuitonga, and the Cook Islands are New Zealand citizens, well then, to draw a line from that, I would say we do not compete with the Cook Islands. We do not compete with the Rarotonga. We do not compete with Niue. They're not a competitor of ours. And I would go as far as say that the islands of the countries that make up the Pacific Island Forum, we shouldn't be looking at them through a competitive lens. Just like in Aotearoa at the moment, we wouldn't be trying to stop the movement of people between Auckland and Queenstown on the basis that we want Auckland to recover first. And obviously, when you look at the trade balance between ourselves and the Pacific region, it's a 3.2 billion two-way trade. It's $1 billion in the favour of Aotearoa. You have to set that aside, and so the reason for setting up a Pacific bubble, assuming all the due diligence and protocols are done, as Dr. Tukuitonga spoke about, for us as New Zealand, for us as a country, it can't be purely about economic gain our way, because the imbalance is so much in our favour as it is. If you think about Fiji, 200,000 New Zealand tourists to Fiji a year, $37.5 million in remittances from, Yvonne mentioned the Pacific economy, 37.5 million of remittances to the Pacific. So my first thought is we shouldn't be looking at the Pacific region and opening up the bubble as losing economic growth into New Zealand at the expense of the Pacific. And of course, that has its roots in that, it's close to 10%, 8% of our population are from the Pacific region. And if you accept that Māori are also people of the Pacific, well, then you've got over 20% of our population whakapapa back to the Pacific region. Also in New Zealand, and Tim, you mentioned that I'm part of a number of business councils. I sit on 6 business councils. And so at our disposal, yes, we've got our Pacific population. Yes, we've got an Indigenous economy that's possibly a solution. But we also have 6 Pacific-facing business councils in New Zealand that are they're member organisations that have over 500 members. Many of them large private sector institutions. And I looked at a letter from the chairman of New Zealand Pacific Business Council that they put out a few weeks ago when we were in that, that safe space that Collin spoke about. But the three key points that I gain out of this letter when I look past the general advocating for a bubble is New Zealand Pacific Business Council are asking for a greater understanding of the benefits, what steps are being taken, so a visibility discussion, and what can we do to help. And those are 3 points from New Zealand Pacific Business Council letter. The New Zealand Fiji Business Council have put out a letter, and there are a number of reasons advocating for the bubble, but the last sentence in their statement is, we are eager to assist, we are eager to help. And so it's just a reminder, that there are institutions, private sector institutions with over 500 organisations who are keen to be involved in the discussion and are keen to have visibility. Second point about regionalism is I think we need to point out that and accept that we're not the only player. So yes, we have constitutional obligations, and we've got obligations through our colonial history through primarily Polynesia. But of course, when we're talking about a Pacific bubble, we need to think about France and their place in the Pacific and their constitutional framework in the Pacific. We need to talk about the United States, of course, American Samoa, Marshall Islands and areas in the northern part of the Pacific. We need to think about Australia's relationship in the Melanesian group, and we need to think about the United Kingdom's colonial relationships through the Pacific. So on one hand, it shouldn't all be about us, and there's a great opportunity for New Zealand and our leaders, and subject to what happens at our election, of course, to take a role in bringing together these powers and these global powers that also operate in the Pacific. Albeit that it's difficult in that, as Yvonne pointed out, that some of the rhetoric coming out of the United States about wanting to step outside regional bodies like the World Health Organization, there's a real opportunity for New Zealand to play a leadership role. And if we, notwithstanding that APEC is going virtual, if you think about what our Prime Minister was able to achieve in the Christchurch call in bringing together countries on protocols around social media, there's an opportunity for us to play a brokering role, albeit in a virtual APEC environment. And eventually, when our Pacific Island Forum leaders come together, they were planning to come together in Tuvalu in August, it's been put off. And I understand a meeting of the 18 economic ministers of the Pacific Island Forum are due to meet in the next coming month. So we've got a perfect opportunity for New Zealand to show a leadership role. The last part I wanted to talk about is, and Yvonne mentioned it, is just that general concern that was expressed early on in the COVID experience about what the new normal might be and going back to how things were. And so, using this opportunity now to broker a better way forward and to make things different. And Yvonne mentioned the PACER Plus agreement. And when I look at the opening statement and purpose of the PACER Plus agreement is about raising living standards, creating jobs, increasing exports in Pacific Island countries. So it's an opportune time for those that work in the space, and I'm sure they are. I'm sure our officials are, is to relook at the regulatory framework. Is it fit for purpose? Is it an opportune time to reframe it? And just as an example, if you look at, say, for instance, Minister Mahuta announced an Indigenous trade agreement between Australia and New Zealand, just as a new way moving forward. I certainly would encourage our officials and our politicians to have a good look at that regulatory framework and decide, is it fit for purpose, and to navigate a new future. Thanks very much. That's all from me for this time being.
Thanks very much, Don. Jemima.
Kia ora koutou, talofa lava, everybody. This is going to be fairly quick because I'm probably going to reiterate or repeat what my fellow panelists have already shared. I have a few comments, mainly around probably my expertise, which is around well-being and mental health. But I want to touch on some of the points the other panelists have talked about. Although the Cook Islands want COVID-free tourists, as Collin had already mentioned, that if there was a risk of opening it up, that those health systems wouldn't be able to cope. But I agree in that opening up the Pacific New Zealand bubble needs to happen because, well, at least to the Pacific realm countries, and it has been mentioned, they should actually be prioritised because of our special relationship with the Pacific, whether it be constitutional or our Treaty of Friendship. And I think it's most important to open up a Pacific New Zealand bubble because it's about also connecting our families and our communities, which have been separated for some time. And we are relational peoples, and something like this can have surmountable impacts. And the well-being of a people's far outweighs economic benefits. So for a community, a community can bounce back fiscally in no time. It may take some time, but in no time. But it's very hard for a community to bounce back for any type of trauma. It could take generations. And so something like this can have long-lasting relationships the more you keep families and communities apart and not addressing the well-being. So I think too, it's also when you do open that Pacific New Zealand bubble, you are mitigating some of the social impacts. As we know, there's disproportionate impacts on females who are most likely to be in insecure employment and not income protected. And in this country, Pacific females, in comparison to other ethnicities, females earn the lowest. So you can only but imagine the financial and economic impacts for our Pacific sisters in our neighbouring countries. Also, I think opening up to Australia, although we all agree that it has huge economic benefits, Australia don't have a elimination strategy. So for our strategy here in New Zealand, it's minimization of the number of people and those infected or sick. And so I guess opening up to a trans-Tasman bubble causes us an even bigger risk than just economic, I believe. And I can see that I can see there'll be some hesitancy in terms of New Zealand tourism because it will compete with the Pacific because lots of our Kiwis want to escape to the Pacific to escape the New Zealand winters. So I see that. So an Anzac Alliance, yes, I can see the worth in it, and there were talks around inviting the Pacific to the Anzac Alliance, but it's more of a risk to our Pacific and more than anything. And I think the important thing here is that there's a fine line between protecting our Pacific and sidelining our Pacific. We tend to preach that we're doing this for the Pacific. It's more like a handout rather than a hand up. But in actual fact, when we talk about dollars, what we're really doing is starting to sideline the Pacific. So it's quite selective in the way that we include our Pacific nations. And yeah, I think that's probably about it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Really interesting thoughts to close on. So I noticed during the session, a few questions had popped up, and Collin, I think, he was all over it. He got onto a couple. But if anyone else wants, I'd like to maybe make sure we go over some of those just to make sure everybody sees them because they may have only come up here to the person asking the question. But the questions there seem to focus on the one hand, which, in your view, as a panel, if we were to sort of move this from this discussion here where we talked about some of the risks, some of the benefits, some of the strategy of the way to go forward, how would it proceed, do you think, in your view? Like, how would what steps would we take? One of the questions there was which countries would be optimal to be that first ring, I suppose, of connection within the bubble. Do you have any thoughts on that? I know Collin maybe he might want to start. He did answer it already, but if others have some thoughts.
Well, thanks, Tim. I have responded, and I prioritized the realm nations, but pretty much the group that I had suggested, Samoa, Tonga, Cooks, and Niue, a small group to start. I think it's important that we have protocols in place for management at the border and all of those sorts of things. So in a sense, it depends on which of the countries are ready and prepared to open up. I know that Samoa took a hard line, which I actually agree with in terms of the border, but they've also signaled their wish to be part of a bubble. So that's what I would suggest in the first instance. Test our systems, see how things evolve. At the bottom line for me is always, is there a risk of a virus in those islands, and is there a risk in New Zealand? And we've got to remember that we need to pay particular attention to people who might have come to New Zealand from Australia and elsewhere. So you'd have to have careful consideration to the management of transit. But the short answer is I would start with the realm nations, Samoa, Tonga.
Thank you, Collin. Does anyone want to chime in on that, or we have one open question that I could pivot to? No? Okay, so this question says, we talk a lot about people moving from New Zealand to the Pacific. Could the panel comment on the situation for Pacific people moving to New Zealand, specifically for work? Noting the news reports of job openings that can't be filled here and businesses complaining about being deprived of services of migrant workers.
Tim, just to comment on that. I was at a New Zealand Tonga Business Council meeting yesterday where one of our executives were talking about the situation with Tongan migrant workers in New Zealand. I think we have about 12,000 migrant workers that come from the Pacific each year. Currently, at the moment, from what I understand from my conversation yesterday, there's about 7,000 Tongans. These are not all migrant workers, but 7,000 Tongans globally trying to get home. So it's not, yes, there is a need for migrant workers here, but I think one thing we also need to remember is there are many Pacific people all around the world trying to get home who can't. And which again is causing all sorts of issues. So it's got to be looked at through multiple lenses. You know, a diaspora around the world trying to get home who can't connect, those who are disconnected from their families who are here, migrant workers who have finished their latest round of work here and then have duty of care. There's duty of care needs in terms of responsibility to those workers. So it's a multitude of things.
Yvonne? Yeah. You're on mute.
Thanks very much. Perhaps a comment which goes beyond the issues that Don just raised about people wanting to go home. I think that the PACER agreement didn't settle on hard commitments on labour mobility, but it does have a side agreement on labour mobility. This was one of the very big issues that the Pacific Islands had in negotiating the agreement. They wanted more liberal, better labour mobility provisions. Now, it seems to me that this is another reason for pressing for the ratification, all the countries to ratify this agreement so we can get it up. You need 8 countries to ratify it before it becomes effective. And so far only 3 have. The labour mobility provisions in the side agreement, while they are softer, they're not hard commitments, nevertheless provide for institutional arrangements for discussing this issue in the future. And I think this is an area where things from the New Zealand and Australian perspective may well change over time. as labour shortage issues prevail while there's lockdown around the world. And so, again, I think we need to look to some of these agreements and leverage them as hard as we can to actually advance the interests. Now, this is the Labour Mobility Agreement is clearly focused on opening up the conditions for which Pacific Islanders can come and work in New Zealand or Australia. So that would be my comment, is leverage these agreements, leverage these institutional arrangements as hard as you can. The questions that we will all be asking now are different than the questions that we were asking a year ago. The issues have changed, and I think there's a lot of scope there for actually leveraging the commitments that are in the arrangement, which are soft commitments, into something better for Pacific Islanders.
So can I just be provocative and say the risk of introducing COVID-19 into New Zealand from the islands is near zero? And on that basis, I would say, why not, if the situation in New Zealand is there's a need for workers to fill whatever it is, and businesses are needing assistance, why would we not permit people from these small group of islands into New Zealand? I'm very mindful, of course, that there are people in New Zealand who have lost their jobs that might be redeployed elsewhere. But just in terms of the Pacific dimension, I would say I would strongly support the idea of having workers from the region as part of the RSE or whatever arrangement that exists.
I think that's my point, Collin. I think things have changed, and I think that there will be more openings for this. You hear in Auckland, I mean, people saying that they're advertising positions $40 an hour and nobody's applying for them in some of the construction areas. So
yeah, we're drawing near the end of the time. Would any of you want to comment then on what barriers you think remain then to getting this started along the lines that you've all discussed today with that first tier of countries? Is it just a question of political will, or are we still waiting for, as Collin, you had mentioned in some of your comments, some of this other surveillance or tracing capacity?
I mean, I think while, sorry, if I could start, while we have cases in the borders in New Zealand, there's a small risk that you might get a case escape and out into the community. And on that basis, I'd proceed more cautiously. I do think, though, that we did a phenomenal number of tests in recent days, and there was not one case of COVID-19 in the community. So I suppose my summary would be to say, yes, recognizing that there are new cases at the border which are being managed, and provided we are confident that those cases are managed adequately and the risk of a cluster coming out as a result of that is low, then I would be advocating some movement on the idea of a New Zealand Pacific bubble as soon as possible. I don't really see what benefits there will be if there are delays. But as I say, cautiously, I would want to see protocols for management at the border. I would want to make sure that there are no stray Australians that sorry, I'm not being disrespectful. You know what I mean, that given the cases, particularly in Victoria, we've got to pay attention to people coming from the US and from Australia and other hotspots, that they don't escape the route and then on into the islands. Last thing I'd say is that these islands are testing already. I know in the French Polynesia, for example, they test you on day 3 and again on day 12, I think. So again, that's an additional assurance measure that might be considered as well, Tim. Thank you.
Yvonne, did you want to comment on that?
Not so much to comment on that, but to take the issue of the need for very good risk management and behavioral protocols around managing the transmission of the virus. Once we've actually assured ourselves on that, I mean, we can create the bubble. But the issue, I think that it's not too early to think about, is that you've got the bubble, and how do we actually maximize the benefits that might accrue from that bubble, short term, medium term? And there are a complexity of issues that need to be addressed, and many of them from a public policy point of view. And my comment on that is it takes time to wind up to actually address these issues. And so the sooner we do that, the better. The sooner we start asking the questions of the why and the how and what time frameworks and the strategies, the better place we'll be. That's all on the assumption that we make that we can control the risk, okay? So there are two separate questions in my mind. One is, how do you control the risk to actually put the bubbles in place? The other is, once you've actually satisfied that you can do that, all right, what's the next steps? What are the other issues that we start to address here to actually drive economic growth? So that's my only comment. And so you gave us a topic here, Tim, today, which is vast in its in the possible comments that could be made.
Thank you for that, Yvonne.
Let's add to Yvonne. Sorry, Don, just finally before we finish, it's a really, and the other point obviously which we spoke about is, yes, there's COVID now, and we will be dealing with it for a long time, but there's, ever-present climate change issues. And, as countries have built up resilient funds or finance mechanisms to deal with climate change, along Yvonne's way of thinking, thought now in terms of resilient funds, in terms of pandemic management moving forward. Climate change is still the biggest issue facing the Pacific region.
Yeah, and it's actually very, very central, in my view, to the long-term tourism proposition.
Jemima.
Yeah, I just wanted to make, conscious of time, just make one quick comment. I think COVID has completely opened up the conversations about lots of things, equity issues in particular, because what COVID has actually done is that it's diverted its attention away from all the other debilitating diseases that have impacted Pacific and other underserved populations for a time, and it's more so our poorer developing nations. And WHO says that 30 million people miss out on vaccines when it comes to polio, measles, meningitis and stuff like that. So this has completely just opened the globe up to what we have been dealing with for generations, really. So yeah, it was just a comment I needed to make.
Sorry, Tim. Mama, yes, I agree. It's opened it up. But let me just remind us all that diabetes and heart disease has not gone away. And it won't go away. And we continue to do so. See, pandemic, as dramatic and as scary as it is a temporary. It might be a 2 or 3 year temporary thing, but nonetheless it's temporary. Climate change, diabetes, and all of the things that we know about will not go away. And I think it's really important to just make that point again. Thank you.
Agreed.
Thank you. Thank you, Collin, and the panel for your comments. I know we're right now at the end of our time together. I just wanted to thank the panelists for their contributions today and really engaging with this. I think we really, particularly in these issues around equity, have really kind of waded into a really interesting perspective on this. And clearly going forward, there's a lot of attention that will need to be paid, deliberation throughout the region by publics and governments to ensure that we get it right. And that's kind of, I think, where we ended up, and not losing sight of all of these other issues that that COVID has exposed for us and brought more to the fore in the regional debate anyways. So I just want to thank you again for taking the time to join us today. And we look forward to seeing our participants here at future webinars or on campus one day. So have a lovely evening and take care.
Thank you.